When we arrived on Amonkhet, we met two very different kinds of zombies. The black-aligned zombies animated out in the sand waste by something called the Wandering Curse, and the white-aligned serving mummies embalmed on purpose to serve the people of Amonkhet. Well, in Hour of Devastation, we meet a third kind of Amonkhet mummy, and it's a lot worse than the other two. It turns out that the people who die in glorious combat in the trials have been taken out. Their bodies have been taken not to rest and not for a paradise, but they've been taken out and coated in this blue stone material called lazotap, purpose unknown for the moment. Their cartouches that they earned during life stay with them and encode their skills and abilities, all the training that they have. And so now we see that, in fact, the purpose of these glorified deaths, the purpose of these trials, was to create people in their physical prime, incredibly well trained, who can then die, be coated in lazotep, be raised as zombie Eternals, and fight as the most incredible undead army any world has ever seen.
So in Amonkhet, you can embalm your creatures so they return mummified. They're white zombies. This is sort of a natural thing that the people on the plane do. It's an Egyptian lore thing. But when we get to Hour of Devastation, it's another set. We wanted to sort of crank it up a notch. So Eternalize is sort of the upgrading version of that, where your creature becomes a 4/4 and actually keeps all the abilities. So this is to symbolize Bolas is doing better than embalming. He's eternalizing.
The Eternalize is a really powerful ability. It adds a ton of power to cards and really impacts gameplay. You take a card like Proven Combatant, one of the worst cards we've ever printed. It's just a 1-mana 1/1. All of a sudden you staple on Eternalize and your opponent may want to try and attack around it. They don't want it to die because if they kill it, then it comes back as a 4/4, which is a lot higher impact.
The numbers 4/4 on Eternalize, I think, came from wanting to be big and feel splashy, but not being so big that we couldn't make them at common, for example. Even as it stands, there were a lot of development challenges working around Eternalize, just because if you have all of these creatures that are coming back at this exact same power and toughness, it makes what I think of as breakpoints really matter. A removal spell that does 4 damage is a lot different than a removal spell that does 3 damage in that context. A 4/5 creature is a lot different than a 3/5 creature, in that one of them can block and kill a 4/4, and the other, they kind of bounce off of each other. So it created a lot of situations where power level was very, very sensitive to just tweaking one number up or down by a point. That said, it was really enjoyable to develop the set around that, and I think that we were able to do a really good job with making Eternalize work. But it was something that we had to think a lot about from a power balance perspective.
Okay, so in Amonkhet, we saw the people go through the trials and they died and they got taken off on a barge across the ocean or whatever, across the waterway, through the gates and something. Now we find out what happens to them. We find out some of Bolas's larger scheme here is he's turning them into an army of zombie soldiers called the Eternals. So we knew, okay, you're going to meet the Eternals, and now the Eternals are blue, black, and red zombies that are these basically zombie soldiers. So we knew we wanted a mechanic for them, and we wanted to make sure that, look, these are a scary, this is a scary army. These are people that follow Bolas's every command because they're mindless zombies. It's kind of the perfect army. You can't ever disobey. They're not afraid of anything. They'll just keep marching on. And so what we wanted to do was made a mechanic that really reflected the idea of no matter what you do, these things are just going to harm you. And so we came up with a flick that's like, block me, don't block me, whatever, you're going to suffer.
Eternal of Harsh Truths is a really good example of an afflict card. It's a 3-mana 1/3, so it's a very easy card to block, but it has afflict too, so you may not want to block it. But if you get hit with it, the opponent gets to draw a card. So you really want to block it, but you don't want to take 2, so it just gives you a really interesting choice to make.
Deserts are something that we knew we wanted to have in the block from the very beginning, even starting with Amonkhet, but we weren't sure exactly how we wanted deserts to play, gameplay-wise. Did you want you to build a deck of all deserts, and put them all together and have these, synergies for playing with deserts? Or do we just want you to play with a couple, or do we just want deserts to be cool lands that had the desert type, but maybe there wasn't that much that keyed off of it. So Amonkhet experimented a little bit with deserts and kind of set the stage, but didn't really blow them out too much. So when we were looking at what to do with Hour of Devastation deserts, we saw a lot of opportunity there to kind of expand that a little bit.
There are a lot of really cool deserts in Hour of Devastation. So first, the original desert, it was a land sometimes, and sometimes it was a spell. So sometimes if you needed mana, you would tap it for mana. But if your opponent was attacking with a 1/1 or something, you could just kill this 1/1 with your land. So that's pretty useful. It's like a card that plays 2 roles. So a lot of the deserts in Hour of Devastation do that too. So for example, Haship Oasis. You can put it in your deck as a forest, and when you need green mana, you get green mana. But if you have a creature in play and your opponent doesn't have a blocker, you can just sacrifice a desert to give it +3/+3 and attack with it. So it's kind of like a giant growth attached to a land. It's kind of like a modal spell. Sometimes you have a land, sometimes you have a spell.
We knew that Hour of Devastation was going to be more about deserts than Amonkhet. It was one of the things that we were playing up in this set. And so we have a common cycle of creatures that all care about deserts. And, you know, it wasn't in, you know, playtesting and balancing the set that we figured this out, but I'm really happy to see that the creative team came through with putting some camels on these cards that care about deserts. Just works really well and adds a nice piece of flavor to the set.
So in Amonkhet, the exert mechanic was on attacking creatures. So you would attack with a creature, exert it, and your creature would get a stat bonus or a keyword ability or something. But in Hour of Devastation, the exert mechanic evolved a little bit. So instead of exerting your attackers, you would just exert your creatures for really cool effects. So for example, Pride Sovereign is a cat that you can pay white mana and tap it and exert it and make 2 cat tokens. And the card gets +1/+1 for each other cat you control. So you can just keep this guy, tap for a turn, make some cat tokens, and then when it finally does untap, it's gigantic.
Exert was a pretty straightforward mechanic in Amonkhet, but in Hour of Devastation, we got to add new things to it. So we have the creatures that have activated abilities where you can exert the activated ability for a larger effect. And we even have the last cycle, where you get to see what happens when you exert yourself. So you cast Oketra's last, and all of a sudden, well, you're back to your starting life total, but you've exerted yourself so much, your land's on untap next turn.
So the exert mechanic allows you to sort of overtap your creatures, and you get an extra benefit. So we wanted to say, what if you did that with spells? Could you sort of overtap for your spell? And this led to cards like Bantu's Last Reckoning, where we'll give you the spell at a much cheaper cost, but your lands are sort of exerted, and so you end up paying for the spell again on the next turn. But in this way, we can sort of create this sweeper card that's only 3 mana, and it may be exactly what you need to save yourself.
After we sort of went through what those card designs would look like, we made a bunch of decisions about them, like we wanted them to be sorceries rather than instants, because if they were instants, there wasn't much choice involved. You could wait until the end of your opponent's turn, see exactly what your opponent chose to do with their turn, and then it was pretty obvious whether or not you wanted to cast this spell, and you weren't really leaving yourself vulnerable because you had full information about what your opponent had done on their turn. Sorceries are much more interesting. Now you have to predict a little bit about what is my opponent going to do on their next turn. You know, if I decide to, you know, tap 3 mana and destroy all creatures, but my lands aren't going to untap next turn, what can my opponent do to me in that sort of 2-turn window there, where I've left myself vulnerable? So the decision making felt really cool, but it also felt really powerful to cast these cards at the same time. And that's kind of exactly the mix that we were going for there.
It was actually kind of a struggle, because at first we were like, how negative can this be? You know, we're seeing one god die, and then another god die, and then another god die. And so we really wanted to emphasize this notion of these gods also were true believers in the system, that these 5 gods were also betrayed by that system.
So what we were doing is, we in Amonkhet introduced concepts, introduced things we knew we wanted that we would then ramp up when we got to Hour of Devastation. You know, okay, there's Embalm, you're bringing back things, but oh, now there's gonna be bigger, more dangerous things. You know, we had Exert, we're gonna add Exert and give you more ways you can use Exert. You know, deserts gets teased, all of a sudden deserts can be a thing. We have these things that we introduced, and then we sort of up the game. Like, you meet the gods, no, meet the real gods, you know, the death, you know, the god-killing gods. So like each level, we built things that we could then ramp up in the final set.